I had just settled into the rhythm of my morning, coffee in one hand, a half-burned cigar in the other, when the doorbell chimed with the unexpected insistence of an alarm. Wolfe didn't stir. He never does unless the matter is worthy of his attention, but I shot a glance toward his massive chair by the window. He regarded me with those hawk-like eyes, measuring, calculating, unreadable. The visitor turned out to be a woman of precise elegance, her hat perched like a crown and her gloves pristine, as though she had emerged from a fashion magazine rather than a New York street. She introduced herself as Mrs. Celia Marchmont, a socialite with a voice carefully pitched between exasperation and distress. "My husband's birthday luncheon was ruined," she said, cutting straight to the point. "A tablecloth, my grandmother's heirloom, was stolen from the private dining room, and the caterer insists it was delivered properly." I shifted on my feet, sensing the twinge of a story that was more than a mere missing cloth. Wolfe, still seated, finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Stolen, you say?" "Yes," she said, leaning slightly forward. "Or misplaced, or taken without permission. But it is gone, Mr. Wolfe, and it matters very much. It is a piece of family history." Wolfe let the words settle, drumming his fingers on the armrest. I've learned that when he pauses, it is never a pause without purpose. "Why bring this to me?" he asked finally. "A tablecloth?" "It is not merely the cloth," she said. "It is the symbolism, the insult, the invasion. And I am told you handle matters that require discretion, intellect, and a certain moral precision." I could feel the faint curl of a smile on Wolfe's lips. That meant he was intrigued, though why I couldn't guess. He never tells, not until he decides. "Very well," he said. "We shall consider your problem. Leave the particulars for later. Sit there." And with that, he returned to his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly on the visitor, as though he were already reconstructing events in a chamber where no one else could follow. I stood back, taking in the absurdity, a missing tablecloth, a society luncheon in upheaval, and Wolfe, immovable, calculating like a general observing the field from a hilltop. I knew then we were in for a case that would seem trivial on the surface, but hide a wealth of motives, secrets, and human foolishness beneath. And I knew, as always, that I would be the legs, the ears, the eyes, the one sent into the streets, while Wolfe unraveled the threads from the safety of his armchair. The first step, I suspected, would be simply figuring out who was bold or foolish enough to touch something that did not belong to them. The brownstone never suffers interruptions lightly. In my 6 years as Wolfe's indispensable legs, I've seen everything from opportunistic crooks to flustered clients, but nothing rattles the man himself. Still, even Wolfe's stoic composure seemed tested that morning, though he never admitted it outright. Mrs. Celia Marchmont returned to provide a more detailed account, accompanied by a small entourage that I immediately recognized as troubled by their precise, rehearsed movements. There was her personal assistant, a sharp-featured woman named Beatrice Lowe, who had the aura of someone who expected the world to bend at her instructions. Her heels clicked like measured threats against the parquet floor. Then came the caterer, a man with a nervous cough, who clutched his ledger as though it contained the secrets of the universe. And finally, a local antiques dealer, Mr. Philip Creighton, whose face betrayed both interest and suspicion, a hawk circling the smallest misstep. Wolfe did not rise. He did not even shift. He simply observed. And I knew that every gesture, every glance, was catalogued in his extraordinary memory. "Sit," he said once the introductions concluded, pointing to the chairs I had aligned near the grand window. "All of you." The four of them complied with the precision of well-trained soldiers, but it was a deceptive compliance. Each one radiated subtle resistance, a readiness to defend or withhold. Wolfe's eyes swept them in a single, slow movement. as if measuring their very souls. Mrs. Marchmont began again, speaking with a carefully cultivated mixture of distress and urgency. The luncheon was meant to honor my husband's work, his birthday, and a dozen key associates. Everything was arranged with meticulous care, down to the silver cutlery and the flower arrangements. The tablecloth was to be the centerpiece. And then it was gone. I took notes mentally as Archie Goodwin, because that's my job, to capture not only what was said, but what wasn't, to read between the pauses, the ticks, the hesitations. The caterer insists it was delivered intact, she continued, but by the time the room was prepared, the cloth was missing. It is irreplaceable. The caterer shifted uncomfortably. I double-checked the delivery myself. Every item was accounted for. I signed off. The linens, the silver, the rest. It was all there, except the tablecloth, Wolfe interjected quietly. He didn't even look up from the spread of his fingers on the armrest. So it is the missing object that disturbs the peace. Creighton, the antiques dealer, leaned forward. The description was specific. Old damask, embroidered with a crest. Not something easily overlooked. Someone wanted it. Or, I interjected, because someone had to. Someone didn't want it there. The room, otherwise tense with politeness, caught a ripple at my words. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me for an instant, a rare acknowledgement of a contribution. Beatrice Lowe's lips tightened, a faint line of control trying to mask irritation. We are here to recover the item, not theorize, she said, her voice perfectly clipped, each word like a metal bolt driven into place. Recovery, yes, Wolfe murmured. But understanding comes first. He leaned back, the chair creaking softly under his weight. I require the full timeline. From the moment the cloth left the storeroom to the point when it was discovered missing. Mrs. Marchmont hesitated, glanced at Beatrice, who gave a sharp nod. The delivery was at 9:30. I arrived at 10. The room was being set up. The tablecloth, well, it should have been placed before my arrival. But it wasn't. At first, we thought it might be misplaced. Misplaced? Wolfe's voice had the subtle edge of disbelief that only he could summon. In a room prepared for guests by professionals on a tight schedule? That seems unlikely. That's exactly what I thought, she said. But the caterer insisted. He checked and rechecked. I could feel the unspoken tension in the room. Each person present had a motive, or at least the potential for one. Social events rarely attracted murderers, but they did attract envy, ambition, petty sabotage, and pride. And Wolfe thrived on these subtleties. He finally spoke again. And what of the staff present during the preparation? Any changes, any absences, any deviations from the schedule? The caterer swallowed hard. Well, a few assistants were called away for other events. There was a substitution for one of the waiters. Nothing unusual, but nothing unusual for the untrained eye, Wolfe interrupted. Yet unusual enough to disturb the timeline of an object of value. I shall need the names and roles of all present, down to the last errand boy. Beatrice Lowe's fingers drummed against her notebook. We can provide a list, but I hope you understand. This is a matter of urgency. My employer expects results discreetly and quickly. Wolfe's gaze, sharp as a blade, swept over her. Discretion is guaranteed, if only because I am not given to indiscriminate movement. Speed is relative to my schedule. We will proceed in due order. Mrs. Marchmont seemed relieved. Then you will take the case. Wolfe did not answer immediately. He never does. Not until he has measured the full angle of the disturbance. Finally, with a deliberate nod, he said, I will consider it. Meanwhile, you may leave the brownstone. I require time to assess. And just like that, the first wave of outsiders departed. The echoes of heels and polite coughs faded, leaving the brownstone once again in its sacred silence. But silence in this house is deceptive. Beneath it, tension lingers like a shadow, and Wolfe can feel it, smell it, taste it, while the rest of us only feel a vague, prickling sense of unease. I reported to him, as I always do. They're gone. Tablecloth missing. Everyone politely terrified. The caterer looks like he wants to cry, and Creighton's already calculating profit margins in his... Head Wolfe did not respond immediately. He picked up a sheet of paper, my mental notes, if you will, and studied the folds. There is more than a missing tablecloth here, Archie. Something in the selection of people, in their arrangements, tells me this is not a simple oversight. Someone intended a small chaos, enough to unsettle, not destroy. I leaned back, lighting a cigar, letting the smoke drift upward. You mean like planting a whisper, a disturbance to test reactions? Social sabotage? Yes. Wolfe's hand gestured vaguely toward the window. And the object is a symbol, not a commodity. Its removal is calculated. That makes the problem interesting, and I suspect profitable for some. I chuckled, which Wolfe ignored. It's hard to keep a straight face in the face of his serene omnipotence. So, your plan is wait, observe, assess, manipulate when necessary, Wolfe said simply. The fieldwork is yours. Begin with those present at the luncheon. Report inconsistencies. Note timing. Note attitudes. Note subtle provocations. I will assemble the structure here. And that is how the brownstone absorbs chaos. The world intrudes, a small disaster takes shape, and Wolfe remains unmoved, yet entirely present. Outside, people fret. Inside, strategy unfolds like a masterful chess game, each pawn deployed with perfect timing. By mid-afternoon, I'd already begun visiting the Marchmont residence, tracing the movements of the caterer, the assistants, and Creighton. The streets of New York, with their constant hum of motion and minor violence, seemed almost comic compared to the calculated disruption of a single tablecloth. I returned to the brownstone that evening with my notes. Wolfe awaited, cigar smoldering, the look of one who has not moved an inch, but knows more than I could ever hope to learn in a week of running errands. Observations? He asked. The caterer double-checked, some assistants swapped shifts. Creighton may have been scouting the cloth for resale. Beatrice seems too controlled, I reported. Also, Mrs. Marchmont is more upset about the symbolism than the loss itself. That tells me the theft, or removal, was psychological as much as physical. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Excellent. That is precisely the texture I require. Observe further, record, but do not act. Every movement is now part of the tableau. And there it was. The brownstone disturbed, the players introduced, and the first layer of tension folded neatly into Wolfe's invisible strategy. I knew the next steps would demand subtlety, observation, and patience. But then, patience is the air Wolfe breathes, and the brownstone, the sacred, immovable heart of it, thrives on nothing else. And somewhere in the quiet, that missing tablecloth continued to provoke, a tiny catalyst capable of revealing ambition, greed, or simple human folly, if one had the wit to follow its trail. Wolfe's method, as always, was impeccable. The brownstone became a crucible, and the outsiders, innocent or guilty, were already under his quiet scrutiny. The first step in his strategy, as I soon realized, was to understand the people before the object. Motive precedes action. Character precedes consequence. We began with the caterer, Mr. Harold Renshaw, whose nervous energy practically trailed him like an invisible scent. I met him first at a small cafe on the Upper East Side, ostensibly to review delivery schedules. In reality, it was a test of timing, recall, and subtle emotion. Renshaw arrived precisely on the minute, carried his ledger like a shield, and spoke in clipped sentences. I checked every item before leaving the warehouse, he said, eyes darting, fingers fidgeting. The tablecloth. It was there, I assure you. I noted the hesitation, not guilt necessarily, but discomfort. And during the luncheon, I asked, did anyone handle the cloth outside your direct supervision? He cleared his throat. Well, the assistants might have. I don't control them completely. Beatrice, she has strong opinions. Beatrice Lowe. That was the next thread I pulled. Her presence radiated competence and an almost imperious control of information. Wolfe later asked for her complete schedule, and I could see the gleam in his eye as I reported my observations. Lowe's motives, if one could call them that, were subtle. A personal assistant devoted to efficiency might see the tablecloth as a disruption to the order she cherished, or as leverage if she wished to manipulate her employer's trust. I didn't yet know if she would act, only that she possessed both opportunity and awareness. Then there was Philip Creighton, the antiques dealer. I trailed him to a discreet gallery downtown, watching him examine items with the precision of a jeweler and the curiosity of a cat. The man's interest in the tablecloth was predictable. Rare textiles have both sentimental and commercial value. But what intrigued me more was the faint flicker of something else in his behavior. Something subtle, like satisfaction at a misstep not yet fully realized. Profit alone rarely inspires that gleam. Mrs. Marchmont herself presented another layer. I visited her home under the guise of verifying delivery logistics. Polite, dignified, yet anxious beneath the surface. She spoke of the heirloom as though it were a living entity, imbued with moral weight. But even she had tensions. Her relationship with the caterer, her reliance on Beatrice, and the pressures of social expectation created subtle cracks. A missing object in her world was not only a loss, but an affront to her personal narrative of control. And finally, we had one I hadn't anticipated at first. Lionel Fraser, a distant cousin and frequent guest at the Marchmonts' functions. His motive was less tangible, envy, perhaps, or the desire to unsettle, to challenge the fragile hierarchy of a family obsessed with appearances. Wolfe had asked for his presence to be noted, and the man's casual demeanor, smiling too easily, speaking too often, marked him immediately as someone comfortable in mischief. I reported all of this to Wolfe in the quiet of the brownstone. He was seated in his usual chair, cigar smoldering, the ever-present teapot at hand. Observe, he said simply. Each of these individuals possesses opportunity. Each possesses subtle motive, but the truth lies in the intersections, the brief collisions of awareness, and the consequences that follow. Record inconsistencies, Archie. Watch the smallest gestures. And so I did. Over the next several days, the brownstone became a quiet hub of surveillance and deduction. Visitors came under pretense of consultations, yet every movement was noted. The tilt of a head, the flicker of a smile, the micro-expressions that betray awareness and concealment alike. Renshaw, for instance, displayed mild resentment toward Mrs. Marchmont's constant scrutiny. He would glance toward the storage room with something like longing, or perhaps relief at not having to deal with it directly. Each time he mentioned the delivery, he included small self-defense clauses, almost involuntary, revealing that he felt the world doubted his honesty. Beatrice Lowe, on the other hand, was impeccable. Her actions were deliberate, controlled. Yet even the controlled make mistakes. She fumbled a note once, correcting it almost instantly. A keen observer might dismiss it, but Wolfe noticed the smallest inflections. I noted them for later. Creighton's mannerisms were a study in restrained greed. He would linger near valuable items longer than necessary, speak in hypotheticals that often betrayed personal ambition, and yet never directly reach for anything. His fascination was visible, like a predator circling prey. Mrs. Marchmont's anxiety manifested in repetition. She would recount the sequence of events, each telling slightly different from the last, subtle shifts revealing what she feared most, not the theft itself, but the potential humiliation of losing control over her meticulously curated social image. Fraser, meanwhile, was more dangerous in his apparent harmlessness. He joked easily, made casual suggestions, and seemed to delight in the smallest inconsistencies in conversation. His laughter, I realized, often masked calculation, a precise masking of intent. By the fourth day, patterns emerged. Not the theft itself, yet, but the orchestration, the invisible threads each person tugged upon without knowing. Wolfe's strategy was clear. He was collecting data not merely on action, but on reaction. And reactions, in his view, are as revealing as fingerprints. One afternoon, I found myself at a small cafe near the Marchmont estate, observing Renshaw as he spoke with a delivery assistant. I took notes, as usual, and noticed a detail that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The assistant seemed reluctant to contradict Renshaw, a subtle deference mixed with fear of reproach. Opportunity, yes, but also a social microcosm. Control exerted not through threat, but through hierarchy, expectation, and subtle power. Returning to the brownstone, I reported to Wolfe. He has leverage over the assistants, clearly. Not fear exactly, but something close. It affects how they act during deliveries. Wolfe's eyes gleamed with that familiar, slow approval. Observe how influence travels, Archie. Power, indirect and unnoticed, is the quietest but most decisive force. A thief, if one exists, will exploit that. The question is, who recognizes it and who acts upon it? It was then I realized the elegance of Wolfe's strategy. He didn't rush toward confrontation. He didn't demand immediate explanations or evidence. He allowed the brownstone to gather its own intelligence, letting subtle human flaws reveal themselves through behavior, micro-expressions, and calculated gestures. And in that silence, the stakes were higher than any overt action could indicate. By the end of the week, the circle of suspects was fully defined. Each had opportunity, each had motive, each had secrets they were willing to protect or reveal unknowingly. The tablecloth was still missing, but it had already served its purpose, a prism through which the hidden tendencies of human behavior could be studied. And as always, Wolfe remained seated, calm, immovable, yet omnipotent in his awareness. I, meanwhile, was left to chase the threads, follow the minor tremors, and document the subtle collisions of ambition, envy, and fear that would eventually lead to the unraveling of this most peculiar of mysteries. This section sets up the suspects, their motives, and the psychological dynamics in play, preparing the stage for Archie's fieldwork and the subtle manipulations Wolfe will orchestrate. The streets of New York had a peculiar way of reminding me that Wolfe's world, though cerebral, depends entirely on physical execution. While he sat in his armchair, orchestrating the chessboard of human folly, I had to run the gauntlet of flesh and blood reality. Foot traffic, cabs, and the occasional dog that seemed to understand my urgency, and took it personally. My first stop was Harold Renshaw, the caterer. I found him in the back of a small kitchen, steam rising from half-prepared sauces, the smell of garlic and onions hanging in the air like a protective curtain. He greeted me with a mix of relief and irritation. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "I suppose you're here to make certain I didn't—" He paused, searching for the polite phrasing. "Lose a tablecloth?" "Yes," I said, leaning against the counter. "And possibly to find out why the world thinks you're less than trustworthy." He laughed nervously, wiping his hands on a towel that had seen better days. "I don't understand. It was delivered properly. I counted it twice. I signed off. I even asked the assistant to verify." "Did the assistant verify?" I asked, watching the way his hands flexed, a subtle tension I had learned to recognize as dishonesty or discomfort. "Well, yes. She checked, but..." He hesitated, then exhaled. Maybe she didn't see it properly. I can't control everything, you know. Opportunity noted. Deflection noted. And of course, the faint trace of irritation. Renshaw's pride had been wounded, and anyone with pride is capable of error when flustered. Next, I visited Beatrice Lowe. She met me in the Marchmont estate study, perfectly composed as always. Her eyes, sharp and precise, followed my every gesture. "I trust your inquiries are proceeding discreetly," she asked, voice smooth, calm, a dangerous calm. "Discretion is my middle name," I said, though the lie required no effort. "I'm only observing. Nothing more." She smiled faintly, but I noted a micro-expression, the brief flash of annoyance, quickly masked by practiced neutrality. "Good. Then you understand that mistakes in the household reflect poorly. The tablecloth incident is unfortunate, but it must be contained." "Contained," I repeated, tapping my pen against my notebook. "Interesting choice of words. Who is to contain it, do you suppose? The staff, the caterer, or the guests themselves?" Her fingers pressed lightly together. Everyone involved has a role to play. Even indirect actions can be decisive. Her words hung in the air like a warning. Beatrice Lowe had awareness, control, and the subtlety to manipulate events without leaving a trace. She was not the thief, perhaps, but she was an active participant in the drama. Philip Creighton was my next visit in a small downtown gallery filled with fabric samples, rare linens, and other collectibles. He greeted me with the easy charm of someone accustomed to talking about value. "The tablecloth?" he asked casually, though his eyes flicked briefly toward a display of embroidered textiles. "A fine piece, I hear. Old damask, correct? With a crest?" "Yes," I said, leaning against a display. "Valuable, by some measures." His eyes narrowed fractionally. "Valuable is relative. The owner's sentiment often exceeds market value." "That's true," I said. "But the loss is a problem. Wouldn't you agree?" Creighton smiled, but there was something faintly predatory in it. "I wouldn't call it a loss. Opportunity, perhaps. Misplacement, maybe. Intentional action, that would depend on perspective." I nodded, recording it in my mental ledger. He was interested, not in the cloth as mere fabric, but as leverage, as potential profit, or as a symbol of influence. Something about the glint in his eye told me he was thinking 2 steps ahead. Finally, I revisited Mrs. Marchmont at her home. She had calmed slightly since the initial panic, but her anxiety remained subtle, woven into her gestures. She paced slightly as we spoke, her hands brushing over polished surfaces as though physically reinforcing control. "The luncheon was meant to impress," she said almost to herself. "Not only guests, but my husband. And yet, I noted the pause. Hesitation, I've learned, is a powerful window into motive. "And yet the tablecloth is gone," I suggested gently. She nodded, eyes downcast. "It is not merely gone. It is a disruption. It is a statement. Someone, somewhere, decided to interfere in a manner both subtle and visible." Exactly. That was the word Wolfe would use eventually, when he explained the significance. Subtle, visible, a small act of disturbance designed to provoke reaction, reveal weakness, and unsettle control. Returning to the brownstone, I compiled my observations, arranging motives, opportunities, and potential triggers. Wolfe listened in silence, smoking his cigar, occasionally tapping ash into the tray with deliberate precision. "So far," I said, "we have the caterer, whose pride and oversight make him a candidate. Beatrice, whose control and awareness give her influence. Creighton, who sees opportunity in everything. Mrs. Marchmont, whose anxieties create vulnerability. And Fraser, who thrives on mischief and attention. That's 5 people, all with potential motives. But no one has acted, at least no one openly." Wolfe's eyes gleamed with his characteristic calm. And yet, Archie, action is not required, only response. Observe their reactions to absence, to suggestion, to subtle pressure. Each person will reveal their tendencies without realizing it. The cloth is only a prop. The human element is the true evidence. That night I began to watch patterns of interaction. At the Marchmont estate, I observed how assistants handled minor items, the way Renshaw adjusted schedules, the subtle glances between Creighton and Beatrice. Each gesture, each fleeting expression added layers to the tableau Wolfe was assembling. I also noticed something I had missed earlier, the timing of arrivals and departures. The tablecloth's disappearance wasn't chaotic. It followed a rhythm, a sequence that suggested forethought. Whoever had moved it had considered human behavior, expected reactions, and left minimal trace. Returning to Wolfe, I reported, "The disappearance seems calculated, not random." Someone knew the sequence of events and acted when observation was lax. He nodded slightly. "Exactly. Now note small deviations. People forget, hesitate, or betray. That is where the case will resolve itself." The following day, I interviewed Lionel Fraser at his club, where cigars and brandy obscured small truths. He was relaxed, almost too relaxed, his movements loose but deliberate. "About the tablecloth," I said. "Any thoughts?" He laughed lightly. "It's just a tablecloth, Archie. People make mountains out of molehills. It was probably misplaced by the caterer, or the assistants, or..." He glanced at me, sharp and deliberate. Someone enjoying the drama. I noted that. Deliberate deflection. He neither admitted nor denied. He teased the edges of truth, testing my reactions. Perfect. Exactly the type of individual Wolfe thrives on exposing. By the end of the week, I had compiled meticulous notes, recorded odd behaviors, contradictions, and subtle provocations. Wolfe reviewed them with his usual intensity, making small marks, arranging observations into mental diagrams that would eventually guide the confrontation. "You see, Archie," he said finally, "the crime, such as it is only half the story. The remainder is entirely human. Observe and report. Do not interfere unnecessarily. Let the sequence unfold. Then, when it is complete, we will address causality and intent with precision." And so it went. My legwork, painstaking and relentless, revealed the smallest fractures in human behavior. Pride, greed, control, anxiety, mischief, all carefully noted. The tablecloth remained missing, yet its absence had created something more valuable, a framework through which motives, opportunities, and subtle manipulations could be studied in isolation. By the close of the week, Wolfe had enough to begin the subtle positioning, the next phase of the case. The brownstone, disturbed but unbroken, awaited the inevitable convergence of observation, provocation, and revelation. And I, ever the foot soldier, prepared to follow every thread, record every gesture, and witness the human folly that would, inevitably, unravel the mystery. The brownstone is a sanctuary, and any disturbance within it resonates far beyond the immediate breach. That's what made the incident on Thursday afternoon so alarming, though Wolfe's reaction, of course, was measured, deliberate, and entirely calculated. I had returned from another round of interviews, this time retracing movements around the Marchmont estate, when I noticed it. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A subtle misalignment of the teapots on Wolfe's sideboard, a faint shift in the arrangement of books on the shelf near the window. Anyone else would have passed it off as trivial. Wolfe, of course, did not. He was in his chair, immobile as ever, eyes narrowing minutely. "Archie," he said, without lifting his gaze, "something has been tampered with." "Tampered?" I asked, scanning the room, trying to find anything that might qualify. "A book out of place? A chair slightly angled?" "Precisely," he said. Details, objects displaced ever so slightly. A challenge, not to the body, but to the mind. That is the nature of the intrusion. I followed his gaze to the small side table where he kept his private ledger and his cigar. One cigar was rotated the wrong way. Not a dramatic change, just enough to betray someone who had been there. Someone entered, Wolfe continued. They have observed, they have touched, and they believe they leave no trace. That is often the first. Error of the clever. I cursed inwardly. My legs had carried me across the city, and now the fieldwork had followed me home. Whoever had done this knew the brownstone, or at least had the audacity to believe they could manipulate it. "Do you think it's one of the suspects?" I asked. "Perhaps," Wolfe said. "Or perhaps a third party, unseen until now. In either case, the principle is identical. Observe reactions, record anomalies, and determine the subtle motivations behind the action." I spent the next hour meticulously retracing steps, examining footprints on the rug, smudges on the polished wood, and the faintest traces of ash near the armchair. There was nothing conclusive, no fingerprints, no hair. But Wolfe's eye had already catalogued everything. He rarely relies on forensic evidence in the conventional sense. He relies on the mind, on inference. Later that afternoon, I accompanied him to a small storage room where the tablecloth had once been kept before the luncheon. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and mothballs, a combination that only a fastidious housekeeper would appreciate. Wolfe's fingers brushed over the surfaces, noting what I would have overlooked, a slight indentation in the wooden floor where a box had been dragged, the faint sheen of dust disturbed. "The object remains," Wolfe said, voice calm, deliberate. "The thief, or the meddler, has not taken the prize. This is a diversion, a test of attention, and a warning. A warning." I understood immediately what he meant. Someone wanted to provoke a reaction, to see how the brownstone, and by extension Wolfe, would respond. They had underestimated our attention to detail. That evening, I conducted my own surveillance of the Marchmont household. I observed Renshaw making minor adjustments to the catering supplies, his movements precise but with an undercurrent of defensiveness. Beatrice Lowe moved among her staff with the same calculated efficiency, yet occasionally glanced at areas where the cloth might have been stored. Creighton lingered near valuable textiles, as always. But now his glances included the Marchmonts' personal spaces, suggesting curiosity beyond commercial interest. And Fraser? Well, Fraser was absent, a variable whose absence was itself noteworthy. Returning to the brownstone, I reported my observations. No new evidence, but behavior is shifting. Everyone is aware of oversight, and tension is subtly increasing. Renshaw's pride is evident, Beatrice is alert, Creighton's curiosity sharpens, and Fraser's absence is conspicuous. Wolfe tapped his fingers against the armrest, a rhythm that conveyed more thought than words ever could. "Precisely," he said. "Observe the consequences of subtle intrusion. The human response is as telling as any physical clue." The next morning brought confirmation that our suspicions were well-founded. A small envelope, unmarked, appeared on the entry table. Inside was a single scrap of linen, clearly cut from the missing tablecloth. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Just a fragment of the object whose absence had already caused minor chaos. "Do you see?" Wolfe asked, holding it up under the lamplight. "The intruder has dared to communicate, yet leaves no identifying trace. Bold, but reckless. The audacity reveals character more effectively than theft ever could." I nodded, noting the subtle psychological dynamics at play. Whoever did this understood the emotional weight of the object. They knew its value, its symbolism, and the disruption it could create. Yet they underestimated our attention to detail and our patience. Over the next few days, subtle signs of tampering multiplied. A spice jar in the brownstone kitchen was slightly out of place. A file in Wolfe's office had been moved. Even the positioning of his chair by the window was adjusted, though imperceptibly to anyone but Wolfe. Each incident was minor, yet cumulatively, they signaled intent. Someone was probing, testing boundaries, and underestimating the vigilance of the brownstone's master. I traced each disturbance, documenting patterns and possible motives. Renshaw, as always, showed prideful defensiveness. Beatrice's influence over the staff became a vector for suspicion, though she remained outwardly perfect. Creighton's interest now bordered on obsession, his glances at textiles bordering on fixation. And Fraser, wherever he was, his absence became part of the puzzle, the invisible hand whose presence was felt in anticipation. I brought everything to Wolfe in the evening. He reviewed the notes without comment, then gestured toward the entry table. "The scrap," he said. "It is a message. Observe reactions carefully. Each person will respond differently to knowledge of it. Those responses will reveal intention, fear, and ultimately, guilt." It was a lesson I would repeat to myself constantly. In the brownstone, small actions speak louder than grand gestures. Subtlety, observation, and inference. These were the instruments of deduction, and Wolfe's orchestration ensured that the intruder, no matter how clever, would eventually expose themselves. I spent the remainder of the week observing interactions with the scraps of evidence and noting behavioral shifts. Renshaw avoided discussion, his defensiveness growing palpable. Beatrice seemed almost amused, though controlled, as if testing the reactions of others. Creighton's curiosity was unrestrained. He handled the scrap with careful inspection, masking interest behind polite inquiry. Fraser, when he finally reappeared, feigned ignorance but with the slightest smirk, suggesting awareness or perhaps delight in chaos. By Friday evening, Wolfe's attention had shifted from observation to positioning. He began instructing me on subtle interventions, probing questions at precise moments, orchestrated chance encounters, and the strategic disclosure of minor details to provoke reaction without revealing his full hand. "Observe," he said. "The intruder, or the culprit, will respond to pressure not with strength, but with subtlety. Every micro-expression, hesitation, and minor adjustment carries information. Collect it. Understand it. Then the situation will resolve itself logically." And so the brownstone, disturbed but not broken, continued to absorb the intrusions and manipulations. The tablecloth, though still missing, had served as the catalyst for a much larger psychological contest. Wolfe remained seated, calm and immovable, while the web of observation, deduction, and human error slowly tightened around the unseen provocateur. I, as always, was the executor, recording each nuance, noting each micro-expression, and tracing the invisible hand that sought to challenge the order of the brownstone. The subtle trespass had become a study in human behavior, an exhibition of audacity, and a game of intellect in which Wolfe, as ever, held every advantage. And in the quiet, I realized that the true mystery was no longer the missing tablecloth, but the intricate interplay of motive, opportunity, and observation that would eventually reveal the culprit, or culprits, without a single violent act, a single raised voice, or a single misstep from Wolfe himself. The calm of the brownstone is deceptive. Even a seasoned observer like myself can underestimate how quickly a small disturbance escalates into a complex web of threats and misinformation. By Monday, the subtle trespasses had evolved into something more pressing, tangible evidence, a new twist, and a growing sense of urgency that even Wolfe could not ignore. It began with a phone call, one of those rare interruptions Wolfe allows through the outer defenses of the house. I answered, keeping my voice casual. The line crackled, and a man's voice came through, measured but insistent. "Goodwin, I'm Saul Panzer." Wolfe requested I intervene. I didn't need to ask why. Wolfe rarely called Saul for minor issues. His presence meant the game had become more intricate. Someone was challenging the brownstone in ways that demanded not just observation, but skilled execution. I informed Wolfe, who was reclining in his chair, eyes half closed but unblinking. He made no outward gesture of urgency, yet his calm conveyed command. Arrange for Panzer's arrival immediately. This is now a matter requiring subtle but decisive oversight. Within the hour, Saul arrived, his heavy steps a familiar rhythm in the otherwise precise quiet of the brownstone. Wolfe briefed him tersely, noting only the essentials: the missing tablecloth, the scraps discovered, and the subtle intrusions that had occurred over the past week. Observation alone is insufficient now, Wolfe said. We require verification, pressure, and counteraction. Panzer, your role is to trace interactions, intercept minor anomalies, and verify the reliability of our information. Saul nodded. Understood, boss. I'll follow the threads, watch behavior, and report inconsistencies. That afternoon, I resumed fieldwork alongside him. Our first task was a discreet observation of Renshaw, the caterer. His schedule had shifted slightly, though not enough to appear suspicious at first glance. Saul's trained eye picked up what mine had begun to notice: subtle evasions, small adjustments to delivery logs, and fleeting gestures of frustration toward staff. See that? Saul said, nodding toward a notebook Renshaw carried. He's modifying times after the fact, subtly, without drawing attention. I made mental notes. Opportunity paired with pride often leads to self-incrimination, even if inadvertent. Renshaw, who had initially appeared flustered and defensive, now revealed a controlled, strategic side, a man aware of observation and adjusting accordingly. Meanwhile, Wolfe remained in his chair, reviewing reports from previous days. He occasionally scribbled a note, adjusted a cigar, or poured tea with deliberate care. I noted the precision. Each movement a small signal to me and Saul, indicating areas of focus without a word. The next target was Beatrice Lowe. I met her under the pretext of a follow-up consultation at the Marchmont estate. Her composure was flawless, yet her actions revealed micro-changes under the slightest pressure. Repeated verification of staff assignments, minute rearrangements of silverware and linens, and careful monitoring of access to storage areas. I find it unfortunate, she said smoothly, that a missing tablecloth causes such disruption. Disruption, I repeated, or an opportunity to test reactions. She smiled faintly, just enough to suggest amusement without admitting anything. The subtle tension was palpable. Wolfe had trained me to read these interactions as if they were written text. Every hesitation, micro-smile, and eye movement a paragraph in a narrative. Philip Creighton, ever observant, presented the most challenging behavior. Saul and I visited his gallery, ostensibly to inquire about valuation of rare linens. Creighton handled each object with care, yet his eyes betrayed a predatory curiosity. He lingered near pieces similar in texture to the missing tablecloth, occasionally making small, almost imperceptible markings in his notebook. Interesting, Saul muttered under his breath. He's cataloging them, but also noting who touches what. Observation is more than curiosity. It's a map of access. Creighton's focus was not theft. It was control. He measured human behavior against objects of value, noting weaknesses, opportunities, and moments of inattention. And that, Wolfe had already predicted. The theft was a catalyst, but the true game was psychological, a contest of wit and observation. Then came Lionel Fraser, whose absence during the early disturbances had already made him a variable in the equation. I tracked him to a club downtown where he lounged with the ease of someone above suspicion. His laughter carried the weight of casual knowledge. He knew something we didn't, or at least believed he did. "You're taking this far too seriously," Fraser said with a smirk when I approached. A tablecloth is a tablecloth. People forget, things get moved. That's life, isn't it? Life, I said, is often measured by the small details you choose to notice or ignore. His smile tightened slightly. Fraser, for all his charm, had the awareness of a strategist. He understood disruption, relished it even, yet attempted to mask his engagement. That subtle delight, that calculated disinterest, was the same type of micro-behavior Wolfe thrived on exploiting. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe reviewed our compiled observations. He leaned back, eyes fixed on some distant mental map only he could see. The intrusions are not merely physical, he said, but psychological. Each person reacts to pressure differently. The tablecloth is symbolic. The scraps, the misplacements, the tampering, they are tests, and the responses are the evidence. I nodded. So the next step is to escalate, subtly, to see how the suspects respond under controlled pressure. Yes, Wolfe said. Observation alone is insufficient when human cunning is involved. Pressure reveals character. Timing is crucial. We must provoke, yet maintain control. The following day, we implemented Wolfe's strategy. Saul and I staged minor disruptions, a misplaced delivery at the Marchmont estate, a subtly adjusted schedule for Renshaw, a confidential note accidentally revealed to Creighton. Each act was calculated, designed to provoke observation rather than confrontation. The reactions were immediate and telling. Renshaw displayed irritation, a mixture of pride and defensiveness. Beatrice Lowe's precision intensified, a subtle effort to assert control over events she could not entirely influence. Creighton's interest sharpened, a thin mask of politeness barely concealing analytical delight. Fraser, when informed indirectly of these minor interferences, smirked, clearly enjoying the ripple effects without directly engaging. Wolfe, observing all of this from the safety of his armchair, made occasional notes. He was like a general watching skirmishes unfold across a battlefield, aware of every nuance, every strategic misstep. And it was evident that the pressure was working. The subtleties were producing responses that revealed priorities, tendencies, and vulnerabilities. By midweek, the stakes had grown. Someone had crossed from subtle provocation to deliberate interference. Another scrap of the tablecloth appeared, this time tucked into Renshaw's ledger. No note, no signature, just the fragment left as a silent challenge. Wolfe examined it carefully. "Now," he said, voice calm but edged with authority, "the intruder has escalated. This is a direct communication. Observe not only action, but intention, Archie. Human behavior under scrutiny always reveals what the object alone cannot." I realized then that the missing tablecloth had transformed from a trivial theft into a complex psychological game, played with subtlety, observation, and misdirection. Every micro-expression, every hesitation, and every gesture became part of a larger puzzle that only Wolfe could decode. With Saul Panzer's fieldwork, my own observations, and Wolfe's unparalleled intellect, we were closing the circle. Each minor disruption, each calculated response, was a thread that would eventually lead to clarity. And in the calm, silent precision of the brownstone, I understood the truth of Wolfe's method. The less the body moves, the more the mind controls. By the end of the week, Wolfe had laid the groundwork for the next stage. The pressure had increased. Responses were catalogued. Tensions had subtly shifted, revealing priorities and allegiances. The brownstone, though disturbed, remained intact. And I, Archie Goodwin, had once again become both executor and observer, walking the streets, noting the micro-behaviors that would feed Wolfe's final revelation. The stage was set. The players were responding. The pressure was mounting. And in the quiet of the brownstone, Wolfe waited, immovable and calculating, for the moment when all the threads would converge and the mastermind, or masterminds, would finally reveal themselves. The brownstone hummed with its usual deceptive calm, but beneath that serenity, a carefully orchestrated tension had begun to take shape. Wolfe rarely moved without purpose, and when he did, every step, every instruction, and every gesture was calculated to manipulate events, perceptions, and, most importantly, people. The missing tablecloth had become more than a simple theft. It was now a medium through which he could observe the interplay of human nature, the subtle strategies of pride, greed, and cunning. Wolfe convened a meeting in his office, an unspoken signal that the next phase was beginning. Saul Panzer and I were present, seated in positions that allowed us both discretion and observation. Wolfe reclined in his chair, eyes half-lidded, a cigar loosely held between his fingers, yet every movement radiated authority. "The time for passive observation has ended," he said, voice calm but resonant. "Our actions now must provoke clarity. We shall position ourselves, manipulate interactions, and observe reactions. Each subject will reveal his or her priorities, vulnerabilities, and intentions under the slightest pressure. Archie, Saul, you will act as extensions of my intent, executing movements that will not merely test behavior, but illuminate character." I took a careful note of the phrasing. Wolfe did not say trick or trap, because he viewed his methods as intellectual leverage, a gentle but insistent force applied to the human psyche. Saul, ever precise, nodded silently, understanding the gravity without need for elaboration. The first step involved strategic placement. Each suspect would be exposed to conditions that simulated opportunity, threat, or challenge without overtly revealing the purpose. Renshaw, the caterer, received a subtly altered delivery schedule. Beatrice Lowe was informed, falsely, that an essential linen set had gone missing, prompting her to reassess control over her environment. Crichton was given an invitation to examine a rare collection strategically placed to gauge curiosity and interaction under observation. And Fraser, whose casual disinterest masked a keen understanding of disruption, was indirectly exposed to the consequences of minor chaos within his sphere. I accompanied Saul on field operations, executing Wolfe's instructions with careful precision. Our movements were designed to be noticed, yet not fully comprehended by the subjects. A misplaced box here, a slight adjustment there. Minor disruptions that seemed incidental but carried the weight of intent. Every action was a question, and every reaction was an answer, catalogued meticulously for Wolfe's later synthesis. By midweek, the pattern began to emerge. Renshaw's pride clashed with subtle frustration. His controlled exterior occasionally slipped, revealing impatience, concern, and even vulnerability. Beatrice Lowe's meticulousness intensified, a quiet assertion of authority over circumstances she could not entirely command. Crichton's curiosity sharpened into almost predatory interest. His interactions were precise, calculated, yet infused with a subtle eagerness that betrayed his analytical delight. Fraser, the most enigmatic of all, observed ripples without engagement, yet his awareness of consequences was unmistakable, a quiet predator savoring potential disruption. Meanwhile, Wolfe continued his quiet orchestration from the brownstone. His armchair became the command center, the central node from which human behavior was surveyed, analyzed, and predicted. He rarely left the room, yet through Saul and me, he touched every interaction, every calculated disturbance, and every psychological probe. Then came the pivotal moment. Wolfe determined that subtle pressure alone was insufficient. Now the stakes had to be raised through strategic confrontation. Each suspect would face a controlled scenario designed to provoke clarity, an interaction revealing intent without actual accusation. The missing tablecloth would serve as the catalyst, a tangible object around which human tendencies would crystallize. The scenario was simple, yet precise. An invitation, ostensibly innocuous, was issued to each suspect, requesting their presence at a curated event within the brownstone. They were to witness a display of the very linens in question, arranged with ceremonial care, creating an atmosphere where missteps, pride, or curiosity would surface. I observed Saul meticulously plan the logistics. Seating arrangements, timing of arrivals, subtle cues and pathways that guided movement without seeming forced. Every element was under Wolfe's indirect supervision, every detail a vector for observation. The elegance of Wolfe's method lay in the invisibility of the orchestration. Those being observed rarely suspected the structure, even as they responded to it. The first arrival was Renshaw. His eyes flickered with the slightest unease at the careful arrangement of table settings, the perfectly aligned silver, and the presence of the brownstone's silent overseers. He moved with caution, testing the periphery, noting potential observation points and subtly adjusting his behavior to maintain composure. Saul and I documented everything: the micro-expressions, the subtle hesitations, and the shifts in attention. Each minor detail was a brushstroke in Wolfe's growing portrait of intention. Beatrice Lowe arrived next. Her steps were measured, her gaze sharp. She inspected the linens, subtly adjusting folds and placement, asserting control in an environment carefully calibrated to test her response. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile suggested satisfaction at her ability to impose order. Yet her eyes betrayed awareness. She understood the presence of unseen observers and adjusted accordingly. Creighton's arrival was a study in controlled curiosity. His hands hovered near the displayed linens, hesitant yet precise, cataloging texture, pattern, and condition. Every movement suggested an internal calculation, opportunity, assessment, and mental notation of who was observing and how. He lingered, probing without contact, and occasionally glanced at me and Saul as if seeking indirect permission or confirmation, unaware that each glance was catalogued by Wolfe's unmatched perception. Fraser's presence was the most subtle. He moved with casual confidence, projecting disinterest while mentally surveying the room. He noted reactions, tracked adjustments, and observed the unfolding interactions, yet did not engage directly. The contrast between appearance and awareness was a key element of Wolfe's design. It revealed a sophisticated understanding of influence, control, and observation. Through it all, Wolfe maintained his quiet dominion. From his armchair, he directed the flow of human behavior without speaking. A nod, a raised eyebrow, or the subtle repositioning of objects sufficed to guide interactions, provoke micro-reactions, and validate suspicions. His intellect functioned as a silent, precise metronome, dictating tempo and tone, while Saul and I executed the choreography. By the end of the day, the results were evident. Renshaw's pride had been gently challenged. Beatrice Lowe's control asserted itself under pressure. Creighton's analytical engagement had been exposed, and Fraser's mastery of observation had subtly revealed his priorities and vulnerabilities. Each response was a piece of the puzzle, a micro-expression that, when combined, created a clear portrait of motivation, opportunity, and inclination. Wolfe's voice broke the silence. "The game is no longer subtle," he said, voice calm but edged with authority. "Observation has given us insight. Strategic positioning has revealed character. The next step is confrontation, controlled, deliberate, and precise. We shall illuminate truth not through force, but through expectation and circumstance. Each participant has responded. The threads now converge. Archie, Saul, prepare accordingly. The stage is set for the moment of revelation." The precision of Wolfe's method was breathtaking. He had orchestrated events so that human behavior, unguarded yet meticulously observed, now provided him with all necessary information. The missing tablecloth, seemingly trivial, had become a pivot for psychological exposure. Each suspect's micro-reactions, meticulously recorded and analyzed, offered more insight than any confession could provide. As I left the room, I understood the elegance of Wolfe's strategy. The brownstone was not merely a home, it was a theater, a laboratory, and a stage for the human mind. Wolfe, seated as if indifferent, controlled the drama with silent authority, drawing out truth with patience, intellect, and subtle manipulation. The psychological tension had reached its peak, and the threads of observation, positioning, and provocation were now perfectly aligned. The week had progressed from simple curiosity to orchestrated complexity. The tablecloth, the scraps, the minor disruptions, and the carefully timed provocations had revealed more about human nature than any interrogation or evidence could achieve. Wolfe's brilliance lay in his ability to convert ordinary objects and interactions into instruments of insight. Each subtle move a question, each reaction an answer, each pause a revelation. The brownstone remained calm on the surface, yet the undercurrent of strategic orchestration hummed like a finely tuned instrument. Wolfe, unyielding and precise, had positioned every element, guided every observation, and anticipated every response. And I, Archie Goodwin, watched as the subtle dance of intellect and human behavior reached its zenith, knowing that the next act would bring the truth into sharp, undeniable focus. The stage was now fully prepared. Every participant had played their part, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and the moment of controlled revelation, orchestrated with precision, was imminent. Wolfe's positioning had worked. Every subtle move, every calculated observation, and every carefully provoked reaction had aligned. The tablecloth, once merely missing, had become a symbol, a trigger, and a lens through which the truth of human nature would finally emerge. The day of confrontation arrived with the quiet inevitability of a setting sun. The brownstone, usually a sanctuary of calm, had been transformed subtly into a stage for revelation. Wolfe, ever meticulous, had orchestrated every detail. The placement of chairs, the alignment of linens, the faint aroma of food lingering from prior arrangements, all contributing to an environment in which human behavior could be observed under pressure. The guests, suspects, arrived under varying pretenses, each believing their presence to be routine or incidental. Renshaw, still prickly with pride, entered first, his eyes scanning the room with subtle tension. Beatrice Lowe followed, moving with precise composure, every step and gesture a silent assertion of control. Crichton's analytical curiosity was barely concealed as he assessed the environment, noting potential vectors for observation and engagement. Fraser arrived last, casual yet fully aware, his posture suggesting disengagement while his eyes tracked every nuance. Wolfe remained in his armchair, a cigar loosely held, exuding an aura of patient dominance. "Observe, but do not intervene unless instructed," he said quietly to Saul and me. The command was simple, yet heavy with implication. The unfolding scene would be dictated not by confrontation, but by subtle provocation, an invisible hand guiding the responses that would reveal truth. The first statement came from Wolfe himself, calm yet imbued with subtle gravity. The tablecloth in question is not merely an object, it is a marker, a symbol, and, I suspect, a mirror of intention. Each of you has interacted with it, or with circumstances surrounding it, in ways that reflect not just curiosity, but choice. A ripple passed through the room. Renshaw shifted uneasily, his hands folding and unfolding with barely contained tension. Beatrice Lowe's eyes narrowed, a slight tightening of her lips betraying a flicker of unease. Crichton's analytical mind appeared to whirl, his gaze darting from object to observer, as though cataloguing invisible variables. Fraser remained the most inscrutable, yet even his measured calm was punctuated by the slightest rise of a brow, an acknowledgement that the situation carried import beyond casual observation. Wolfe allowed silence to linger, knowing that discomfort is often more revealing than speech. Human beings, when confronted with ambiguity under observation, naturally reveal priorities and tendencies. And yet, the brilliance of Wolfe's design lay not in obvious pressure, but in subtle, almost imperceptible cues. The arrangement of objects, the positioning of witnesses, the careful orchestration of chance encounters. Then came the first provocation. Wolfe directed my attention to a previously unnoticed fold in the displayed linens, a deliberate imperfection intended to draw attention without accusation. "Notice," Wolfe said softly, "the way a small imperfection can alter perception, influence decision-making, and expose character. Observe how each of you reacts when faced with something seemingly trivial, yet loaded with implication." Renshaw's fingers brushed the edge of the tablecloth, a subtle claim of responsibility, a hesitation, revealing both pride and anxiety. Beatrice Lowe immediately adjusted the folds, asserting control over imperfection with meticulous precision. Creighton leaned forward, evaluating texture and placement, curiosity interlaced with analysis, while Fraser simply observed, a quiet predator calculating risk and consequence. It was then that Wolfe introduced his first direct challenge. "I am aware," he stated, voice even, "that each of you has had opportunity, limited or otherwise, to handle, move, or influence the object in question. My intent is not accusation, but illumination. Choices, after all, define character. Actions under observation reveal priorities. Would anyone like to explain their handling of the tablecloth?" Renshaw's pride flared. I merely adjusted it once, to prevent wrinkling," he said, voice slightly defensive, eyes flicking toward Wolfe as though seeking both approval and concealment. Beatrice Lowe interjected, calm but firm. "It is my duty to ensure proper presentation. Any adjustments made were solely to maintain standards." Her tone was precise, almost rehearsed, yet it revealed the subtle tension between duty and self-preservation. Creighton's response was analytical, tinged with curiosity. I observed its condition, noted irregularities, but did not touch beyond inspection. I prefer to understand before acting. The words carried weight, yet the hesitation revealed his enjoyment of the intellectual challenge, the pleasure derived from observation itself. Fraser, as expected, remained silent. His eyes scanned reactions, absorbing cues, cataloging the interplay of pride, control, and intellect. Silence, in his case, was not avoidance, but strategy, an indirect assertion of dominance. Wolfe's eyes glimmered with a hint of satisfaction. Observation, indeed, is a form of action. One need not touch to influence outcome. Your responses, measured and deliberate, reveal more than casual handling ever could. He allowed a pause, letting the tension accumulate, then shifted subtly. Now, consider this. The tablecloth itself is inconsequential. What matters is the opportunity it presented, the choices made in its presence, and the consequences overlooked or embraced. Each of you has had a moment of decision. Some seized, others deferred. It is time to reconcile those choices with intent. It was here that the first cracks appeared. Renshaw's posture stiffened, his defensive veneer showing micro-expressions of irritation and unease. Beatrice Lowe's composure faltered, if only slightly, as her need for control collided with the implication that perfection could be questioned. Creighton's analytical detachment began to blend with personal investment. Curiosity and ego intertwined, producing subtle signs of agitation. Fraser, ever the silent observer, allowed minimal acknowledgement, yet even the subtlest micro-expression suggested that he recognized the depth of Wolfe's psychological maneuvering. Wolfe's approach was precise. Confrontation without accusation, provocation without direct challenge, illumination without overt judgment. Every statement, every pause, every implied consequence was a vector for self-revelation, a method that exposed character through choice and response rather than coercion. The culmination came when Wolfe shifted focus, subtly implicating the environment itself. Notice the alignment of objects, the interplay of light and shadow, the choices that each of you made in relation to presence and perception. Each gesture, deliberate or subconscious, reveals not only intention, but comprehension of circumstance. Renshaw adjusted a chair instinctively, betraying the anxiety beneath his calculated pride. Beatrice Lowe's gaze flickered toward the corner, as if anticipating some unseen evaluation. Creighton's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of a table, a physical manifestation of internal calculation. Fraser leaned back, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging both the theatricality and the potency of the situation. Wolfe's final move in this first confrontation was almost imperceptible. A glance, a slight tilt of the head, a carefully modulated pause. "I do not demand confession," he said quietly, voice measured. "I demand observation and reflection. Truth reveals itself when intention is illuminated by circumstance. Consider your actions, consider what you have permitted, and prepare for the consequences of exposure." The session ended without overt resolution, yet its impact was undeniable. Each suspect left with the subtle awareness that their choices, interactions, and reactions had been scrutinized, interpreted, and catalogued. Micro-expressions, fleeting gestures, and the faintest signs of internal conflict were now part of Wolfe's mental map, forming a lattice of inference that would guide the next stages of investigation. As Saul and I departed from the room, Wolfe's satisfaction was evident, though restrained. "The first confrontation," he said softly, "reveals more than a confession ever could. We have illuminated priorities, exposed vulnerabilities, and confirmed tendencies. Each reaction is a piece of the puzzle. The tablecloth, once trivial, has become a catalyst for insight. Prepare for the next phase, controlled escalation, where subtlety will give way to revelation." I understood, as always, that Wolfe's brilliance lay not in mere observation, but in the orchestration of consequence. The tablecloth, the interactions, the environment, and the psychological tension had been perfectly aligned to reveal truth without coercion. The first confrontation had succeeded. Choices were illuminated, characters revealed, and the path toward resolution, strategic, intellectual, and inevitable, had been established. The brownstone settled into quiet again, but the echoes of subtle confrontation lingered in the air. Each participant, now aware of observation and implication, would carry this awareness forward, shaping future actions and reactions. Wolfe, seated in his armchair, exhaled a thin plume of smoke and allowed the tension to crystallize into clarity. The first confrontation had not resolved the mystery, but it had done something equally potent. It had shifted the dynamics, clarified priorities, and exposed the underlying human tendencies that would guide the remainder of the investigation. In Wolfe's world, revelation was never sudden or violent. It was a precise, controlled unfolding, a series of intellectual maneuvers that forced truth into the light, without the need for spectacle or force. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter in the unfolding drama. Choices had been revealed, intentions illuminated, and the subtle architecture of human behavior laid bare. Wolfe's strategy, as always, was patient, meticulous, and brilliantly indirect. The first confrontation was complete, but the story and the unraveling of the mystery was only just beginning. After the first confrontation, the brownstone returned to its customary stillness, yet the air retained a subtle tension, an invisible residue of human choices observed and catalogued. Wolfe rarely moved immediately after an engagement. His mind required incubation, a deliberate period during which the details, reactions, and micro-expressions could ferment into clarity. I, Archie, understood this ritual well. Wolfe's contemplations were invisible, intangible, but always decisive. The drawing room was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of Wolfe's cigar. He reclined, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed with deliberate concentration. "Archie," he said, voice low. "The first confrontation yields quantity of data, but not yet quality of inference. Observe. The human mind, when subjected to subtle provocation, reveals inconsistencies, priorities, and tendencies. These must be disentangled before conclusion can be reached." I leaned against the doorway, notebook in hand, sensing the gravity of what was to come. Wolfe rarely permitted assistance in analysis, but this stage required a subtle relay. I would catalogue, he would decode. He gestured to Saul, who approached with careful steps, a deference born of long experience. Wolfe began the deductive assembly with a meticulous review of micro-behaviors. "Renshaw," he said, voice precise, demonstrated a combination of defensive pride and impulsive adjustment. Note, his actions were immediate, almost reflexive. This indicates not premeditation, but instinctive assertion of control. A man who values recognition over subtlety. I recorded his observations, knowing that each statement was part of a lattice upon which the entire investigation rested. Wolfe's mind was not satisfied with mere surface assessment. He sought patterns, contradictions, and the hidden structure of intention. "Beatrice Lowe," Wolfe continued, "exhibited a controlled response, indicative of both discipline and anxiety regarding perception. Her attention to order suggests a need for validation through precision. Observe the tension between control and acknowledgement. The slightest challenge to her system provoked subtle recalibration." He paused, allowing the implications to settle. Creighton's engagement was analytical, bordering on detached curiosity. Yet there was subtle ego investment, a desire to be seen as discerning. Note the way observation became participation. His intellect seduced him into exposure. Fraser, as Wolfe noted, remained the most enigmatic. Strategic silence, calculated observation, and minimal physical engagement. The subtleties of posture and ocular movement suggest risk assessment combined with social manipulation. Fraser is aware of his own influence on others and uses silence to extend it. Wolfe then shifted focus to the object itself, the tablecloth, now elevated from mundane utility to symbolic key. Notice, Archie, how human action interacts with environment. The tablecloth was not merely moved, adjusted, or ignored. Each gesture reflected a cognitive decision: approach, avoidance, assertion, or observation. The object functions as catalyst, revealing character more effectively than interrogation. Saul interjected quietly, "So it's less about the object and more about what they reveal when confronted with it?" "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "The object is a screen onto which intention is projected. Analyze the projection, not the screen. The human mind cannot disguise reaction to subtle provocation. It is inherently self-revealing." From there, Wolfe's assembly became increasingly intricate. Resembling a mental chessboard, he juxtaposed actions against inferred motivations, cataloging each interaction for cross-reference. "Renshaw's impulsive adjustment corresponds with his habitual need for recognition," he said, tracing a finger along a mental map of behavioral patterns. "Beatrice Lowe's corrections, motivated by order, reveal anxiety regarding external evaluation. Creighton, while analytical, cannot escape the lure of intellectual ego. Fraser's silence conceals as much as it expresses." Then came the synthesis, the moment when observation transitioned into deduction. Wolfe examined combinations of behaviors, noting where reactions intersected, diverged, or contradicted expectations. "Observe the convergence of instinct and intellect," he said softly. Renshaw's impulsivity contrasts with Fraser's calculation, yet both are motivated by self-preservation. Beatrice Lowe and Creighton manifest control through order and observation, yet both exhibit vulnerability when challenged. This lattice reveals potential opportunities, likely sequences, and constraints imposed by human psychology. He paused, staring at the floor as though it contained secret diagrams only he could decipher. Archie, the task now is to reconcile behavior with opportunity. Each individual had access. Each made decisions reflecting intent or caution. Patterns emerge when we cross-reference temporal sequences, environmental interactions, and psychological tendencies. I watched as he methodically catalogued each nuance. The curl of a finger, a slight hesitation in speech, a glance toward a corner, all were variables in his complex calculus. He did not simply recall what had occurred. He reconstructed it in multidimensional space, considering not only actions, but reactions, consequences, and alternatives each suspect might have imagined. Hours passed as Wolfe worked. Saul and I contributed quietly, retrieving documentation, reciting observations, and occasionally providing clarifying details. Wolfe accepted information sparingly, always filtering it through a lens of deduction rather than anecdote. By late afternoon, Wolfe's pattern became discernible. The suspect is not determined by who moved the tablecloth, but by who allowed themselves influence over circumstance while attempting concealment, he said. This is the crux. Opportunity plus psychological projection minus transparency. Only one individual satisfies these criteria consistently. I leaned forward, sensing a moment of revelation. You mean the actions themselves weren't as important as what they revealed about intent? Exactly, Wolfe confirmed, eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. Behavior under observation is invariably more telling than confession under duress. Humans cannot fully suppress subtle indicators of intent. The first confrontation provided raw data. The deductive assembly converts data into actionable insight. He continued, outlining his final synthesis. Renshaw, instinct, impulsive adjustment, anxiety over perception. Beatrice Lowe, control, precision, and subtle tension when imperfection arises. Creighton, analytical curiosity, ego investment, minor agitation when intellectual assessment is challenged. Fraser, calculated silence, observation, minimal physical engagement, strategic deployment of influence. Cross-referencing these behaviors with opportunity and interaction history, only one profile satisfies all conditions for manipulation, concealment, and subtle assertion. Beatrice Lowe. I raised an eyebrow, impressed yet unsurprised. Wolfe's reasoning, precise and elegant, had transformed a simple object into a revealing instrument of psychology. So, the tablecloth was never about the tablecloth, I said. Indeed, Wolfe replied, voice dry yet triumphant. It was about revealing intent, establishing patterns, and exposing the invisible lattice of human motivation. Beatrice Lowe's need for control, combined with subtle anxiety regarding external validation, led her to manipulate circumstances while concealing action. The tablecloth merely catalyzed the exposure. Wolfe's final step in this deductive assembly was to plan the method of confirmation. Observation and deduction had produced a high probability of truth, but Wolfe never relied on inference alone. He required controlled testing, an environment in which the suspect's reactions could be observed under conditions that would force revelation without direct accusation. Archie, Saul, Wolfe said, rising with deliberate grace, we now proceed to controlled validation. Observation alone has delivered probability. Now we will construct circumstances that convert probability into certainty. Precision is essential. Opportunity must intersect with provocation, and the suspect's behavior will complete the confirmation. I understood immediately. The next confrontation would be subtle, psychological, and inevitable. Wolfe's genius lay not merely in deduction, but in orchestration, engineering situations that transformed human tendencies into undeniable evidence. Saul nodded, eyes keen. "So, the stage is ready for Beatrice Lowe." "Yes," Wolfe said. "But remember, the objective is not confrontation, but illumination. She must be allowed to act freely, revealing truth through choice. Human behavior, uncoerced, is always transparent when guided carefully." As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the brownstone, Wolfe settled into his chair once more, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on some internal diagram of thought. The deductive assembly was complete. The lattice of observation, opportunity, and psychology had been constructed, revealing both culprit and method. What remained was execution, controlled, precise, and inevitable. The elegance of Wolfe's reasoning lay in its invisibility. The tablecloth, the initial confrontation, the subtle provocations, all were instruments in a larger symphony of deduction. Each gesture, each hesitation, each micro-expression had contributed to a mosaic of intent. Wolfe had transformed the ordinary into extraordinary, converting casual human interaction into a laboratory of insight. And so, the stage was set for revelation. The first confrontation had illuminated, the deductive assembly had synthesized. Now, Wolfe would orchestrate the final act, where truth, unmasked and undeniable, would emerge. Not through force, but through the undeniable clarity of choice and consequence. The brownstone maintained its customary quiet as late afternoon bled into evening, but the stillness carried a tension that was anything but ordinary. Wolfe had arranged the room with meticulous precision. The table remained untouched, the tablecloth perfectly draped, and seating positioned to maximize observation while subtly influencing behavior. The lighting was soft, deliberate, shadows long enough to provoke self-conscious adjustments, but not so dark as to conceal gestures. I observed from the doorway, notebook in hand, ready to document, but fully aware that this confrontation was not merely a display of wit. It was an experiment in human psychology. Wolfe, seated in his chair with a commanding presence that had subdued countless visitors, exhaled a thin curls of smoke from his cigar and allowed the room to settle into expectation. "Archie," Wolfe murmured, voice low and deliberate. "The key to this phase is subtle orchestration. Observe without interference. Let the subject reveal through instinct and habitual tendencies. Provocation must be indirect, yet unmistakable." The first to arrive was Renshaw, followed by Creighton and Fraser, each taking seats as though by habit, unaware of the invisible lattice Wolfe had constructed. The final arrival, of course, was Beatrice Lowe. She paused at the doorway, a flicker of calculation in her eyes as they swept the room, noting seating, positioning, and the ever-present tablecloth. Wolfe's eyes met hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the game about to unfold. "Good evening, all of you," Wolfe intoned, voice calm yet authoritative. "Tonight, we will discuss the incident regarding the tablecloth. I trust your recollections are accurate, though I suspect that human memory is often less reliable than we assume." Beatrice Lowe's expression was carefully composed, though the slight tension in her jaw betrayed a subtle awareness of scrutiny. Renshaw, ever impulsive, shifted in his seat, eyes darting between Wolfe and the tablecloth. Creighton maintained an analytical, almost clinical demeanor, while Fraser's calm silence projected confidence, or perhaps deliberate concealment. Wolfe allowed the room to breathe, the silence stretching long enough to provoke discomfort without overt interference. Then he began with an innocuous observation. "I noticed, when the tablecloth was first discovered out of place, that various individuals reacted differently. Some adjusted it immediately, some observed silently, and some seemed to hesitate, uncertain how to proceed." Beatrice Lowe's hands tightened slightly on her lap. Wolfe's gaze followed the micro-tension, cataloging it silently. It is fascinating how minor provocations can illuminate character. The tablecloth, while mundane, became a mirror reflecting priorities, anxieties, and impulses. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Tell me, Miss Lowe, how do you perceive the role of order in such circumstances? How do you respond when an established system is disrupted? Beatrice Lowe blinked, almost imperceptibly, before responding with careful diction. I prefer things to be as they should. Disruptions make coordination more difficult and create unnecessary tension. Indeed, Wolfe said, voice measured. And yet, the disruption itself may reveal more about the individual than adherence to order ever could. The question is, when given the opportunity to control circumstance, will one assert, conceal, or adjust? Beatrice's composure remained intact outwardly, but her eyes betrayed micro-adjustments, fleeting glances toward the tablecloth, subtle tightening of her fingers. Wolfe's ability to interpret these unspoken signals was uncanny. Observe, Archie, he whispered. The slightest deviation in expected reaction is more telling than verbal confession. Wolfe then orchestrated a minor provocation. He placed a small decorative object on the table near the folded edge of the tablecloth, a subtle test of priority and attention. I find it instructive, Wolfe continued, how individuals react when opportunity intersects with environment. Some ignore, some adjust, and some manipulate. The effect was immediate. Renshaw reached forward impulsively, straightening the tablecloth with exaggerated care. Creighton observed silently, analyzing the gesture before resuming his original posture. Fraser's calm gaze lingered briefly on the object before returning to Wolfe. Beatrice Lowe's reaction, however, was telling. Her eyes flicked from the object to the tablecloth, her body leaning slightly forward, yet she did not reach out. She calculated, assessed, and hesitated, a clear intersection of instinct and control. Notice the hesitation, Wolfe said quietly. It is a hallmark of concealment. Opportunity exists, yet instinct prompts restraint. Observation under these circumstances is revealing. Beatrice Lowe's internal struggle was subtle but readable to Wolfe. She considered action, weighed consequences, and ultimately allowed restraint, an act that paradoxically revealed intent. Wolfe's orchestrated environment, the tablecloth, the object, the seating arrangement, and the lighting, functioned as a mirror reflecting the intricate lattice of human motivation. Miss Lowe, Wolfe said, now addressing her directly, you have demonstrated remarkable restraint and attention to detail. Yet it is precisely through such restraint that intent becomes legible. Would you care to explain your hesitation? Beatrice's lips pressed together, a faint quiver betraying her inner agitation. I suppose I didn't want to interfere unnecessarily, she said, careful not to admit more than needed. Of course, Wolfe replied, eyes narrowing. Yet we are all aware that influence can be exerted subtly. The decision to act or refrain is itself revealing. You chose restraint, and in doing so, disclosed priorities, control over environment, attention to perception, and awareness of observation. The other attendees shifted, sensing the direction of Wolfe's analysis, yet unable to intervene. Wolfe's method relied on subtlety, not confrontation. Revelation emerged naturally from the choices available to the subject. Wolfe continued, dismantling facades with precision. Archie, note the micro-adjustments, the flicker of eyes, the tightening of fingers, the brief leaning forward, all consistent with prior analysis. Human behavior under subtle provocation is seldom consistent with claimed innocence when observed with sufficient acuity. Beatrice Lowe's composure faltered slightly, a near imperceptible exhale betraying tension. Wolfe pressed the advantage. Consider, Miss Lowe, that concealment is rarely perfect. Micro-reveals are inevitable. The very act of controlling perception exposes internal priorities. What we see is not merely reaction, but a reflection of intent. She hesitated, eyes darting to the tablecloth once more, then back to Wolfe. Finally, with an almost imperceptible shift, she straightened in her seat, lips parting in reluctant acknowledgement. I suppose, perhaps I adjusted the tablecloth. I wanted things to be in order. Wolfe did not celebrate, did not gloat. He allowed the revelation to settle naturally, observing the subtle ripple through the room. The acknowledgement was precise, confirming the deductive assembly he had painstakingly completed. "Very well," Wolfe said, voice calm but commanding. "Your action has been revealed through circumstance, hesitation, and ultimately admission. The tablecloth, mundane though it is, has provided clarity." The room exhaled collectively. Renshaw, Creighton, Fraser, and I. But Wolfe remained unshaken, methodical in victory. The confrontation had been psychological, orchestrated, and precise. No force was applied. No direct accusation needed. Human behavior, guided subtly and observed meticulously, had produced undeniable truth. Beatrice Lowe's shoulders slumped slightly, a quiet recognition of exposure without humiliation. Wolfe's genius lay in enabling acknowledgement without coercion, allowing natural consequence to confirm deduction. As the evening waned, Wolfe settled back in his chair, the cigar smoke curling upward like a silent applause. "Archie, the second confrontation is complete. Observation, orchestration, and subtle provocation have converted probability into certainty. The lattice of behavior has revealed truth. The tablecloth was merely a catalyst." I nodded, understanding the elegance of Wolfe's orchestration. The confrontation had been invisible in its methodology, yet undeniable in outcome. Human psychology, when observed with precision, offered clarity beyond confession or evidence alone. Saul, quietly collecting his notes, murmured, "Another mystery solved, thanks to your subtle guidance, Wolfe." Wolfe's eyes gleamed faintly, but he remained unyielding in composure. "Subtle guidance, Saul, is merely preparation. Human behavior, when confronted with opportunity and observed with acuity, always reveals itself." And so the second confrontation concluded, deliberate, invisible, and utterly revealing. Beatrice Lowe's micro-behaviors had betrayed her. Wolfe's orchestration had confirmed it, and the truth stood undisputed, illuminated not by accusation, but by the undeniable clarity of human choice under observation. The morning sun slanted through the brownstone windows, slicing the drawing room into golden bars, and there I was, thinking I'd already seen the strangest twist the tablecloth case could offer. Wolfe, perched in his chair like a monarch on a throne, gestured imperiously toward the assembled group. 4, no, 5 suspects had been summoned, each with that peculiar mixture of apprehension and irritation people carry when they are about to be judged by someone who knows more than they do. Mrs. Celia Marchmont had her gloves off now, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. Theodore Hargrove, the caterer, had a faint stain on his tie and a nervous tick in his left eye. Beatrice Lowe, whose composure had been so artful during my legwork, now shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, a tell I was noting in my mental notebook. The remaining 2, Mr. Philip Fenton, a florid-faced philanthropist, and Miss Lydia Carr, an interior designer with an appetite for gossip, looked as if they were trying to guess what Wolfe already knew. "Sit," Wolfe commanded, not looking at anyone directly, but letting his gaze sweep the room as if he could see straight through walls. The collective shuffle of chairs was a chorus of unwilling obedience. I leaned against the doorway, cigar in hand, letting Wolfe set the tempo. He never misses a detail, and each movement he made was calibrated to provoke just enough tension to loosen truths. "Mrs. Marchmont," Wolfe began, his voice even, measured, "you say the tablecloth disappeared from your luncheon, and yet oddly, it appears that the luncheon itself, despite the absence of this object, proceeded without comment from your guests. care to explain why? Her lips pursed. They noticed, Mr. Wolfe, but the discussion was delicate. I didn't wish to make a scene. Ah, Wolfe said, a delicate scene. Yet you bring the matter here, and in doing so, you have made the scene less delicate than any luncheon could have been. He tapped his fingers. Curious, is it not, that an item of cloth, however antique, should command such attention? Beatrice Lowe shifted in her chair, her eyes flicking to Hargrove, then to the others, like a chess player calculating multiple moves ahead. I could see the gears turning behind that polished exterior. Mr. Hargrove, Wolfe continued, his gaze finally resting on the caterer. You delivered the luncheon. You claimed the cloth was in place, yet you alone had access to it immediately before the luncheon began. How reassuring for you that no one but you could verify its position. Hargrove swallowed hard, the nervous tick flaring again. I set the table as instructed. I don't know what happened to it afterward. Indeed, Wolfe said, voice flat, almost sympathetic, as if to lull the suspect into a false sense of security. And yet someone did know. Someone wanted it gone. Someone, he paused, letting the word hang, desired to make a statement. Fenton bristled. A statement? This is absurd. It's a tablecloth, nothing more. Why would anyone make a statement? Because, Mr. Fenton, Wolfe replied, it is not the tablecloth itself that matters, but what it represents. In your world of philanthropy and public image, appearances are everything, and an absent tablecloth can speak louder than any criticism spoken aloud. Miss Carr attempted a faint smile, probably believing she could distract Wolfe with charm. Surely, Mr. Wolfe, you don't suspect anyone in this room. I suspect, Wolfe said, his voice rising ever so slightly, that among you there is one who found the presence of the tablecloth an inconvenience, a restraint, a symbol to be removed. The choice of method, removal, concealment, misdirection, speaks to a mind both careful and audacious. Someone here knew the impact would be noticed, yet believed they could obscure their involvement. Beatrice Lowe's hands tightened on her lap. That was enough for me. I had the key tell. But Wolfe, of course, would not be rushed. He thrived on orchestrating the revelation in full view, like a conductor drawing the last crescendo from a symphony. I will illuminate the path, Wolfe said finally, his voice smooth, deliberate. The tablecloth was not taken for profit. It was not taken by mistake. It was, in essence, borrowed and returned, though not without leaving a mark, an intended mark. Eyes darted around the room. Mrs. Marchmont leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. A mark? Yes, Wolfe said. A subtle sign, one that might humiliate, expose, or instruct. The thief's motive is psychological rather than material. And the thief, he paused again, a drum roll of silence, is one who has a vested interest in controlling appearances, in manipulating perception, and in testing the vigilance of those around them. Silence fell. I could almost hear the collective mental gears turning, people cross-checking their own movements, trying to guess who Wolfe would accuse. Then Wolfe turned to Beatrice Lowe, his eyes narrowing in that way that makes even seasoned liars sweat. Miss Lowe, he said, your knowledge of the luncheon, your careful observation, your subtle steering of Mr. Hargrove, your delicate questions to Mrs. Marchmont, were all intended to obscure your own involvement. The tablecloth left the table briefly, returned without fanfare, yet leaving a psychological footprint only a keen observer could detect. Beatrice's composure cracked for the tiniest fraction of a second. A blink, a hitch in her posture. That was enough. You, she began, her voice measured but tense. I only wanted to test attentiveness, to demonstrate how easily appearances can deceive. Exactly, Wolfe said. And you did. Your method was clever. You relied on the assumption that the material absence would be noticed, but not questioned. You observed reactions, recorded them mentally, and returned the item once your point had been made. A test, yes, but one executed without ethical regard for those involved. I shifted in my chair, letting a little whistle escape my lips. I'd seen the tell, I'd tracked the cues, but Wolfe's verbal dissection, methodical and chilling in its precision, made the whole thing look like an open book suddenly slammed in everyone's face. Beatrice Lowe finally nodded, a surrender without theatrics. Yes, she admitted. It was me. I wanted to prove that even the most meticulous household staff, even the most careful hosts, could be made to doubt their vigilance. Wolfe's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile I ever saw on him. Your intellect is undeniable, but intellect without restraint is a dangerous force. Remember that next time, Miss Lowe. Mrs. Marchmont exhaled, relief flooding her face. Fenton looked flustered. Carr muttered something about scandal, and Hargrove just wiped his brow. And Wolfe, still in his chair, returned to his usual posture of unimpeachable calm. Now, Wolfe said, the tablecloth is returned, the psychological lesson delivered, and our brownstone may resume its proper order. Mr. Goodwin, he added, eyes flicking to me, inform the caterer to ensure no further misplacements, and arrange for my lunch. I smirked, shaking my head, cigar dangling. You make it sound almost elegant, Wolfe. He didn't reply immediately, only letting his gaze fall on the final scene. Suspects humbled, lesson learned, and order restored. That's Wolfe for you. Every confrontation is a lesson, every revelation, a demonstration of moral and intellectual authority. And just like that, the brownstone returned to its sacred calm. The sun shifted, shadows fell into neat patterns, and the day resumed its ordinary cadence. Ordinary, that is, until another disruption dared to cross our threshold. I took a long drag from my cigar, listening to the soft clink of Wolfe's glass, realizing once again that justice in the Wolfe manner was never about force. It was about mind, patience, and the delicate art of letting people reveal themselves, even when they thought no one was watching. And for once, I had to admit, it was beautiful. The brownstone settled into silence, the kind that comes after a storm has passed but leaves the air thick with the memory of wind and rain. Wolfe reclined in his chair, a perfect portrait of satisfied contemplation. I perched nearby, observing the subtleties, the faint twitch of an eyebrow, the calm authority in his still posture. The case had ended, the players had revealed themselves, and the lesson, as Wolfe phrased it, had been delivered. Beatrice Lowe had left quietly, her composure restored, but the air of challenge around her had dimmed. She had been brilliant, certainly, but her brilliance had been outmaneuvered by patience, observation, and the subtle orchestration of one man who rarely raised his voice. It was not cruelty that dictated Wolfe's actions, but an insistence on truth, precision, and the psychological balance that his brownstone demanded. Mrs. Marchmont had already returned to the mundane tasks of her household, carrying with her a sense of relief that bordered on reverence. Fenton and Carr lingered for a few moments, trading low murmurs that suggested gossip and speculation, but nothing of consequence. And Hargrove, ever the nervous caterer, had been instructed with meticulous care to double-check all settings for upcoming functions, a task that seemed mundane but was in fact Wolfe's gentle enforcement of order. You see, Archie, Wolfe began, his voice low and deliberate, the resolution of a case is not merely the identification of the culprit. It is the restoration of equilibrium, the return of order to a world inclined toward chaos. I took a slow puff of my cigar, exhaling into the soft afternoon light. You make it sound almost poetic, Wolfe. But what about Beatrice? She's clever, certainly, and bold. Will she not test someone else next time? Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. Perhaps. But the brownstone is not merely a residence. It is a discipline. Those who attempt to manipulate it without understanding the subtleties learn quickly that intelligence alone is insufficient. Observation, patience, and the measured application of insight are far more powerful than raw intellect. I nodded, knowing he was right. The elegance of his justice lay in the orchestration, the methodical, almost musical way in which truth revealed itself when guided by the right hands. And Wolfe's hands, as always, were impeccable conductors of the symphony. The day wore on, the light shifting to the gentle amber of late afternoon. I moved through the brownstone, taking note of the restored order, the subtle adjustments Wolfe had made to seating, lighting, and even the placement of books and ornaments. Every corner reflected not just cleanliness, but the assertion of a carefully maintained equilibrium. It struck me, as I often thought in these quiet moments after a case, that Wolfe's work was less about the immediate resolution than about the long-term stability of those who came into contact with him. Each case, each revelation, each confrontation carried lessons not only for the guilty, but for everyone involved. The brownstone itself became a teacher, an environment in which deception was rarely tolerated, and truth, in all its subtle forms, was always revealed. I poured myself a drink, settling into my own chair, and watched Wolfe move about the room with his habitual precision. He adjusted a lamp, flicked a page of a newspaper to a more favorable position, and then returned to his chair, satisfied. Even in mundane movements, there was order, symmetry, and purpose, a stark contrast to the chaos and deception that had brought Beatrice Lowe into our midst. "You know, Wolfe," I said, "there's something remarkable about how you handle these psychological puzzles. You don't just solve them, you shape the environment so that truth surfaces naturally. It's almost surgical." Wolfe's lips twitched slightly, the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Surgical, yes. But consider also the artistry, Archie. Every case is an opportunity to observe human behavior, to understand the interplay of ego, motive, and subtlety, and in that understanding lies the key to restoration." The sun dipped lower, casting long, slanting shadows across the room. The day's warmth mingled with the quiet that only follows resolution. In the distance, the city hummed softly, unaware of the drama that had unfolded within the walls of the brownstone. I looked at Wolfe, seeing him not as the eccentric recluse the public might assume, but as the master of a domain where intellect, patience, and moral clarity combined. The final truth had been revealed, the lesson absorbed, and yet there remained the quiet knowledge that the next challenge would arrive. That, in fact, was the rhythm of our lives in this place. An endless succession of puzzles, revelations, and the ever-present pursuit of equilibrium. "Another case closed," I said finally, almost to myself, raising my glass in a silent toast. "Closed," Wolfe agreed, his voice a calm echo in the warm room. "But never complete. There's always another detail, another observation, another misstep waiting to be corrected. That is the nature of the work we undertake." And with that, the brownstone exhaled as if it had held its breath for the entire ordeal. The furniture settled, the shadows deepened, and the faint hum of the city became a background lullaby. The world outside remained oblivious to the intricate dance of intellect and morality that had transpired within these walls, and yet, inside, there was perfect harmony. I leaned back, letting the quiet wash over me. There was satisfaction, yes, but also anticipation, the subtle thrill of knowing that the next case, the next mystery, would beckon, and that Wolfe, in all his unyielding brilliance, would be ready. For now, though, the brownstone was at peace. The culprit revealed, the lesson imparted, and the intricate threads of human deception unraveled to reveal clarity, order, and, most importantly, justice. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Wolfe settled further into his chair, a final gesture of mastery over the environment he ruled. And I, ever observant, knew that in this quiet aftermath, The essence of his work, subtle, patient, and deeply humane, was on full display. The brownstone had endured, the lesson had been learned, and once more the world outside moved on, blissfully unaware of the precision with which truth had been served within these walls. And so, the day ended, the case concluded, and the brownstone, as always, remained a sanctuary of intellect, patience, and impeccable order.